She said, "I have a date tonight, I will be late." The jealous Mafia boss went quiet and put on his cigarette. The rain didn't just fall on the city. It attacked the floor-to-ceiling glass of Barnaby Wickliffe's penthouse like a warning from the underground, each drop a percussion note in tonight's symphony of violence. I stood exactly 3 feet from his obsidian desk, my tablet pressed against my ribs, waiting for him to finish the encrypted call that had already stretched 20 minutes past our scheduled briefing time. He didn't acknowledge my presence. He never did, not immediately. That was part of the carefully choreographed performance we'd maintained for 3 years, this dance of professional distance and suffocating tension that crackled between us like voltage neither of us dared ground. "I don't negotiate with men who forget their place," Barnaby said into the phone, his voice dropping to that lethal whisper that made crime lords reconsider their life choices. His diction was pristine, every word enunciated with the kind of precision that came from years of turning language into a weapon sharper than any blade. "If Dimitri believes he can restructure our agreement after his product has already moved through my channels, remind him what happened to the last associate who thought my patience was infinite." I kept my face perfectly blank, my eyes trained on a point just beyond his right shoulder where a Caravaggio original hung in controlled museum lighting. Judith beheading Holofernes, a study in cold-blooded determination worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. Barnaby collected art the way other men collected trophies. Each piece selected not for aesthetic value, but for the narrative it told, about power, brutality, and the price both demanded. He ended the call without ceremony, setting his phone down on the leather desk pad, with a control so absolute it felt more dangerous than violence. Only then did those slate-grey eyes lift to mine, the kind of gaze that had broken stronger people than me. "The Rotterdam shipment," I said before he could speak, my voice leveled despite the way his attention always felt like being studied by a predator deciding whether to strike. "Moved up to Wednesday at 9. Volkov's people confirmed the route change. 3 vehicles, separate times, exactly as you specified. I've arranged for Callum and 8 men to sweep the warehouse 6 hours prior." Barnaby leaned back in his chair, the movement causing his charcoal dress shirt to pull against a frame that had nothing to do with expensive tailoring and everything to do with the private training facility he maintained 4 floors below. The top 3 buttons were undone, as they always were by evening, revealing the column of his throat and the suggestion of collarbones beneath, a calculated casualness that somehow made him more intimidating. "And the Singapore contracts." His voice was silk over steel, the faint British inflection appearing only on certain vowels in a way that absolutely should not have affected my pulse the way it did. I swiped through my tablet with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over. "Signed and secured. The cryptocurrency transferred through the Cayman accounts this morning. No flags, no delays, no complications." "Good." He reached for the crystal tumbler on his desk, the scotch inside catching amber light from the recessed fixtures. "Single malt, aged 25 years, probably worth more than my monthly salary." He never touched alcohol during business hours, but once darkness claimed the skyline, Barnaby permitted himself this single indulgence. 1 drink, never 2. "The Merrick situation is resolved," I continued, my tone as sterile as a surgical report. "His daughter's medical bills have been handled in full, including the experimental treatment in Geneva. He's withdrawn his testimony and issued a formal retraction to the district attorney's office. The case is dead." Something that might have been satisfaction flickered behind Barnaby's eyes, there and gone so quickly I could have imagined it. "The senator's fundraiser is confirmed for Saturday," I pressed on, not waiting for acknowledgement. "I've cleared your schedule from 6 to midnight. Your cover will be the Wycliffe Foundation donation, education reform, specifically literacy programs in underserved communities. Your actual meeting with the defense contractor is scheduled for 9:15 in the private study. 15 minutes, no more. And you've prepared the talking points are on your secure drive. 3 key initiatives, each with supporting statistics and carefully constructed sound bites that will photograph well for his campaign literature. I've also included 6 potential questions from reporters and your recommended responses." Barnaby's mouth curved almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile, but close enough to make my stomach tighten in a way I'd spent 3 years pretending didn't happen. This was my value. This was what I did. I anticipated his needs before he articulated them, solved his problems before they became complications, and maintained the illusion that his empire ran on inevitability rather than the 1,000 invisible hours I devoted to keeping every plate spinning. I was essential, indispensable, the woman who knew where every body was buried because I'd often helped him choose the location. And tonight I was going to walk away from all of it. "There's one more thing," I heard myself say, the words tasting like betrayal and freedom in equal measure. "I need to leave early tonight. I have a date, I'll be late." The silence that followed wasn't just absence of sound, it was a void, a vacuum where oxygen used to exist. Barnaby didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. He simply reached for the silver case on his desk, the one I'd seen exactly 17 times in 3 years, always before something terrible happened. His fingers, long, elegant, scarred across the knuckles from a past he never discussed, extracted a single cigarette with the kind of deliberate care a surgeon might use removing a bullet. The lighter's flame illuminated his face from below, casting shadows that transformed him from merely dangerous into something primordial, something that hunted. "A date," he repeated, smoke curling from his lips like a visible manifestation of the threat coiling in the air between us. How unexpected. His eyes hadn't left mine, not once, and in that unwavering grey stare I saw the truth I'd been running from for 1,000 days. Barnaby Wycliffe had never considered me his employee. He'd considered me his. And I had just declared war. Before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comment section where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a gun barrel. I watched Barnaby's face for any reaction, a flicker of surprise, a tightening around his eyes, the microscopic tells I'd learned to read over 3 years of studying him like a foreign language I desperately needed to master. Nothing. His expression remained perfectly neutral, carved from the same cold marble as the Bernini sculpture in the corner of his office, but I knew better than to trust the surface. Barnaby's stillness was never passive. It was the eye of a hurricane, the moment before a predator's strike, the held breath before a building collapsed. "A date," he said again, as if testing the weight of the words. As if they were a puzzle he needed to solve. His voice held no inflection, no emotion, nothing but that devastating calm that preceded every act of controlled violence I'd ever witnessed him commit. I forced myself to maintain eye contact. "Yes, Adrian Merrick, we knew each other in college, he's in town for a conference." Why was I explaining? I didn't owe him explanations. I was his personal assistant, not his property. I had a life outside these glass walls, outside the gravitational pull of his empire. Or at least I used to have a life. Before Barnaby, Wycliffe became the sun my entire existence orbited around. "I see." Barnaby set down his scotch with the kind of precision that made the simple gesture feel deliberate, calculated. His hand moved to his breast pocket, and I heard the distinct metallic whisper of the silver case sliding free. My pulse spiked. I'd seen him reach for that case 17 times in 3 years, once before he'd ordered a man's execution, 3 times before major territory negotiations, twice before meetings with law enforcement he was about to compromise, and 11 times when someone had done something that had triggered whatever primal instinct lived beneath his tailored suits and perfect diction. The case opened with a soft click. Inside, 6 cigarettes lay in perfect parallel lines. Each one hand-rolled, probably imported from somewhere obscenely expensive and morally questionable. Barnaby didn't smoke casually. He smoked when the careful control he maintained over every aspect of his existence was about to crack. He extracted a single cigarette with 2 fingers, the movement almost ceremonial. The lighter appeared in his other hand, platinum, monogrammed, engraved with something in Russian I'd never been close enough to read. The flame erupted with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. For a moment, Barnaby's face was illuminated from below, all sharp angles and dangerous shadows, his grey eyes reflecting the fire like a wolf's might catch moonlight. Then he touched the cigarette to the flame and inhaled. The tip glowed orange-red, a tiny sun in the darkness of the storm-shrouded penthouse. And something fundamental shifted. The man behind the desk was no longer Barnaby Wycliffe, CEO of Wycliffe International Holdings, philanthropist, patron of the arts, pillar of the community. That version had been a mask, carefully maintained, meticulously crafted. What remained was something older, something carved from violence and possession, and the kind of hunger civilized men spent their lives pretending they didn't feel. "What time is your date, Clara?" He exhaled smoke in a slow stream, his eyes never leaving mine. 7:30. "And where are you meeting Adrian Merrick?" My name in his mouth, not Ms. Whitlock, not my formal title, just Clara, intimate and possessive in a way that made my skin feel too tight. "Lucia's, the Italian place on." "I know where it is." Another drag on the cigarette, the tip flared brighter. "I own it." Of course he did. Barnaby owned half the restaurants in the city, either directly or through the labyrinthine network of shell companies and silent partnerships that comprised his legitimate businesses, the ones that laundered money from the enterprises that existed only in encrypted files and whispered conversations. "I've arranged for a table at 8, I said, hatting how my voice wanted to waver. "I'll have my phone if there's an emergency." "There won't be an emergency." Barnaby stood, and the movement was liquid, predatory. He walked to the window, the cigarette held loosely between two fingers, smoke trailing behind him like a visible manifestation of threat. "You've ensured my evening runs smoothly. You always do. You're extraordinarily thorough, Clara. It's one of the many things I value about you." The way he said value made it sound like own. "I should go," I managed. "I need to change, I need." "Yes." He turned from the window, and the city lights behind him created a halo of illumination that made him look like a fallen angel surveying his conquered kingdom. "You should. Enjoy your date with Adrian Merrick. I hope he appreciates how extraordinarily fortunate he is." I didn't run from the office. I walked with the measured pace of someone who hadn't just seen civilized society crack open to reveal the monster underneath. But my hands were shaking when I reached the elevator, and I couldn't stop thinking about the way Barnaby had said Adrian's name. Like he was memorizing it. Like he was adding it to a list. The little black dress I'd chosen felt like armor against myself. I checked my reflection one last time in the bathroom mirror of my apartment, a space Barnaby had never seen, would never see, a sanctuary that existed outside his gravitational pull. The woman staring back at me looked almost normal. Almost like someone who had a life that didn't revolve around encrypted files and territory negotiations and the careful management of a criminal empire. Almost. Adrian was already at the table when I arrived at Lucia's, and the sight of him made something in my chest simultaneously loosen and tighten. He looked exactly as I remembered from college, warm brown eyes, easy smile, the kind of uncomplicated handsomeness that belonged to men who'd never ordered someone's execution or owned art stolen from museums, or built empires on fear. "Clara," he stood, pulling out my chair with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that should have been charming. "You look incredible." "Thank you." I sat, accepting the menu from a waiter whose face I didn't recognize. Not one of Barnaby's people. Probably, maybe, I couldn't tell anymore. "So, senior architect now." Adrian launched into easy conversation, his voice animated as he talked about the Singapore project that had brought him to the city. "The sustainability features alone are revolutionary. We're talking about a building that produces more energy than it consumes." I tried to focus on his words, tried to let the normalcy of it wash over me. This was what regular people did. They had dinner. They talked about their jobs, real jobs, legal jobs, the kind that didn't require burner phones and offshore accounts. They smiled and laughed and didn't calculate exit strategies or sweep rooms for surveillance. But my eyes kept drifting to the restaurant's entrance. A black SUV slid past the window, tinted windows reflecting the streetlights. My spine went rigid. "Clara, you okay?" Adrian's hand covered mine on the table. "Fine, sorry, long day." I forced a smile, pulled my attention back to him. He was safe, he was normal, he was everything Barnaby wasn't. So why did his touch feel wrong? "I was saying," Adrian continued, either not noticing or politely ignoring my distraction, "that I'd love to take you to the architectural exhibition at the museum tomorrow. They have this incredible." The door opened. A man in a dark suit entered, scanning the room with the kind of systematic precision that made my blood run cold, not looking for a table, looking for something else, someone else. My hand went to my purse, to the phone inside, to the panic button Barnaby had installed in my contact list 3 years ago. "If you ever need me," he'd said, "you press this. I don't care where you are or what's happening. I will come." The suited man sat at the bar, ordered a drink, didn't look at me again. Paranoia, that's all this was. I was seeing ghosts, shadows, threats that didn't exist because Barnaby had trained me so thoroughly to see the world the way he did, as a chessboard where every piece was either an asset or a liability, where trust was currency and safety was an illusion. The exhibition sounds wonderful, I said to Adrian, my voice too bright, too forced. He squeezed my hand. I've missed you, Clara. When you disappeared after graduation, I thought maybe I'd done something wrong, but seeing you now, successful, thriving, you've clearly built an incredible life for yourself. Incredible, yes, that was one word for it. Another black SUV passed outside, then another. This was absurd. The city was full of black SUVs. Half the executives and businessmen in the metropolitan area drove identical vehicles. It didn't mean anything. It didn't mean Barnaby had me followed. It didn't mean he was watching. Except Barnaby was always watching. Tell me about your work, Adrian said, cutting into his pasta with the relaxed ease of someone who'd never had to wonder if their food was poisoned. You said you're a personal assistant. That must be challenging, I supplied, reaching for my wine glass. My hand trembled slightly. My employer is very particular. Demanding boss, huh, I get it. My last project manager was a nightmare. Everything had to be perfect, every detail micromanaged. But you learn to adapt, right? I thought about the last time someone had failed to meet Barnaby's standards. The man had left the city within 48 hours, his business dissolved, his reputation strategically destroyed with a few carefully placed phone calls and leaked documents. Barnaby didn't tolerate imperfection. He eliminated it. Right, I echoed, you adapt. The door opened again. This time a couple entered, laughing, oblivious, normal people living normal lives. I wanted to be them so desperately it physically hurt. Clara, Adrian's voice pulled me back. You keep looking at the door if you want to leave. No, I forced myself to focus on his face, on his kind eyes, on the possibility of a life that didn't involve criminal empires and possessive mafia bosses who looked at me like I was something they owned. I'm exactly where I want to be. The lie tasted like ash. Because even here, in this restaurant filled with wine and laughter and the illusion of freedom, I could feel Barnaby's presence like a hand around my throat. I'd left his office, but I'd never truly left his shadow. And somewhere in the rain-soaked city, I knew he was waiting to prove it. It started with the hostess. One moment she was laughing with a couple at the entrance, the next her face had gone chalk white. She dropped the menus she'd been holding. The leather folders hitting the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire restaurant. Her eyes fixed on something behind me, something at the door, and I watched her mouth form a single word. Sir. Not a greeting, a warning. The couple she'd been seating gathered their coats without being asked. At the table beside us, a family of 4 suddenly remembered an urgent appointment, the father throwing cash on the table with hands that trembled. Within 30 seconds, half the restaurant was in motion, patrons standing, reaching for wallets, heading for the exit with the kind of orchestrated panic that spoke of survival instinct. What's happening? Adrian asked, twisting in his seat to look toward the entrance. I didn't need to look, I already knew. The temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. The air pressure had changed, the way it does before a storm, before violence, before the world cracks open and reveals the abyss underneath. I could feel him the way prey senses a predator, some ancient part of my brain screaming warnings my conscious mind had spent 3 years trying to ignore. Clara, Adrian's voice had gone tight. Who is that? I finally turned. Barnaby Wycliffe stood in the entrance of Lucia's like a fallen angel, surveying a conquered circle of hell. The charcoal overcoat he wore was perfectly tailored, probably cost more than Adrian's monthly salary, and made him look like death dressed for the opera. Rain glistened in his dark hair. His grey eyes swept the restaurant with the kind of calculated assessment a general might give a battlefield before deciding where to strike first. Those eyes found mine and held. The remaining patrons didn't need further encouragement. They fled, a silent exodus of people who understood on some primal level that they were witnessing something dangerous, something private, something that might end in blood if they stayed to watch. Within 2 minutes, the restaurant was empty except for terrified staff members who'd retreated to the kitchen, and the 3 of us. Barnaby moved through the space with liquid grace, each step deliberate and unhurried. He stopped at a neighboring table, pulled out a chair, the one at the head position, and carried it to ours as if he'd been invited, as if this was perfectly reasonable behavior. He set it down, not between Adrian and me but at the head of our intimate two-person table, transforming it into something else entirely. Something hierarchical, something where he commanded the apex and we were supplicants at his court. Then he sat, crossing one leg over the other, adjusting his cufflinks with the kind of casual precision that made the gesture feel choreographed, threatening. Adrian Merrick, Barnaby's voice was silk wrapped around a blade. He didn't extend his hand, didn't smile, simply acknowledged Adrian's existence the way a god might acknowledge an insect. Architect, Princeton graduate, currently employed by Merrick and Associates, a mid-tier firm specializing in sustainable design. Single, no outstanding debts, no criminal record, no remarkable qualities whatsoever. The color drained from Adrian's face. How do you? I know everything about everyone who enters my employee's orbit. Barnaby tilted his head, studying Adrian with the detached interest a scientist might show a specimen under glass. It's prudent. You understand prudence, don't you, Adrian? The careful consideration of potential risks before they become actual problems. I found my voice. Barnaby, what are you doing? Having dinner. His eyes remained locked on Adrian even as he answered me. You said you had plans. I found myself with an unexpectedly free evening. It seemed serendipitous. This is insane. You can't just... I own this restaurant, Clara. Now he looked at me, and the possessive intensity in that gaze made my breath catch. I can do whatever I wish within these walls. As it happens, what I wish is to meet the man who thought he could take you to dinner. Adrian's hands were shaking now, his wineglass trembling against the white tablecloth. To his credit, he tried to rally. Look, I don't know who you are or what kind of game this is, but Clara and I are on a date. A private date, so maybe you could. Game, Barnaby savoured the word like vintage wine. An interesting choice. Tell me, Adrian, do you play chess? What? Chess, the game of kings. Strategy, sacrifice, absolute domination. Barnaby leaned forward slightly and Adrian instinctively leaned back. I'm quite skilled at it. I've been playing a particular game for 3 years now. Very high stakes, very complex. And just when I thought I understood all the pieces on the board, a new one appeared. His gaze slid to Adrian with the lazy attention of a cat watching a mouse. A pawn, perhaps, or maybe just a distraction that needs to be removed from play. But the threat wasn't even veiled. It was naked, elegant, absolute. Adrian pushed his chair back. Clara, I think maybe we should. Stay. Barnaby didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The single word carried the weight of empire, the certainty of someone who'd never been disobeyed and survived. We haven't even discussed your intentions toward my assistant. Surely you can spare a few minutes to explain what makes you think you're worthy of her time. And in that moment, watching Adrian's hands shake, watching the sophisticated lethality radiating from Barnaby like heat from a forge, I understood the terrible truth. I'd never had a choice. The game was already over. And Barnaby had won before Adrian even sat down. I arrived at Lucia's at 7:45, fashionably late, wearing a dress I'd bought specifically because Barnaby had never seen it. Sapphire silk that caught the light when I moved, cut just low enough to be deliberate. Adrian was already seated, looking exactly as I remembered, sandy hair, kind eyes, the sort of dependable handsomeness that came with a stable career in corporate law, and a 401k he probably checked quarterly. He stood when I approached, kissed my cheek, pulled out my chair. All the correct gestures. All the things a normal man did on a normal date in a normal world, where your boss didn't look at you like you, were something he'd already decided to own. You look incredible, Adrian said, and I could tell he meant it. I can't believe it's been 5 years. We ordered wine. We talked about college, about his conference, about the weather and the city, and all the safe, meaningless topics people discussed when they were testing whether the chemistry they'd once had still existed. It should have been pleasant. It should have been exactly what I needed, a reminder that life existed outside Barnaby Wycliffe's gravitational pull. Then the door opened, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Barnaby moved through Lucia's like he owned it, which he did, wearing the same charcoal shirt from the office, still with those 3 buttons undone, a cigarette burning between his fingers in flagrant violation of the city's smoking ordinances, the kind of violation no one would dare mention to him. He approached our table with the inevitability of an execution. Adrian Merrick, Barnaby said, and it wasn't a question. Columbia Law graduated middle of your class. You work for Morrison and Associates, specializing in contract disputes. Divorced 18 months ago. No children, modest apartment in Brooklyn, a Toyota Camry you've owned for 6 years. Adrian's face went pale. I felt my stomach turn to ice. Barnaby pulled out the chair beside me, not across from us, beside me, and sat with the casual authority of someone who'd never been told no in his life. He took a slow drag of his cigarette, exhaled, and continued with the same clinical precision he used when dismantling business rivals. You're competent, adequately educated, financially stable within the narrow parameters of middle-class achievement. Another drag, the ember glowed like a warning. But you're soft, Adrian. You've never had to protect anything that mattered. You've never faced real consequences. You wouldn't know what to do with a woman like Clara if someone handed you an instruction manual. Barnaby, I started, but he silenced me with a single glance. You can't give her what she needs, Barnaby continued, his voice dropping to that lethal whisper. You can't match her, you can't challenge her, you certainly can't keep her safe in a world that would devour someone like you before breakfast. Adrian stood, his napkin falling to the floor. I think I should go. Yes, Barnaby agreed, you should. I watched Adrian leave, watched the door close behind him, watched my attempt at normalcy disappear into the rain-soaked street. Barnaby took another drag of his cigarette, those grey eyes finally turning to me. You're late for work, Clara, and you're wearing a dress I haven't seen before. The rain hammered against the limousine's armoured roof as Barnaby's driver, Callum, always Callum, the man who'd witnessed more of Barnaby's darkness than anyone else alive, pulled away from Lucia's. I sat as far from Barnaby as the confined space allowed, my back pressed against the opposite door, the sapphire silk of my dress suddenly feeling like a costume I'd been caught wearing. Barnaby hadn't spoken since we'd left the restaurant. He simply sat there in the leather-scented darkness, the city lights streaming across his face in alternating patterns of shadow and illumination, that goddamn cigarette still burning between his fingers like a tiny beacon of everything wrong between us. The partition between us and Callum was up, soundproof, privacy glass so dark I couldn't see the streets we were moving through. We could have been anywhere, we could have been nowhere. Just this contained universe of leather and tension, and 3 years of unspoken truths finally demanding acknowledgement. You had no right. My voice came out steadier than I felt, but I could hear the tremor underneath, the crack in the professional facade I'd maintained for 1,000 days. You had no right to do that to him, to humiliate him, to protect what's mine. Barnaby's voice was silk over razors. He took a final drag of the cigarette and crushed it in the crystal ashtray built into the armrest, the gesture deliberate, final. To prevent you from making a catastrophic mistake with a man who couldn't survive 10 minutes in your actual world. My actual world, I laughed, and it sounded brittle, broken. My actual world is answering your phones and managing your schedule and pretending I don't know that half your business associates are one bad decision away from federal prison. My actual world is being your accessory. Accessory, he repeated the word like it was a foreign language. Is that what you think you are to me? What else would I be? The words were coming faster now, 3 years of carefully controlled professionalism fracturing with each syllable. I'm your assistant, Barnaby. I'm the woman who makes your coffee and books your flights and lies to prosecutors about your whereabouts. I'm convenient, I'm useful, I'm essential. He moved before I could process the motion, closing the distance between us with the fluid precision of a predator who'd decided the hunt was over. His hands found the leather seat on either side of my hips, cagging me, his face inches from mine. You're essential, Clara. You're the only goddamn thing in my life that isn't bought, bartered, or built on mutually assured destruction. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the scotch and smoke and expensive cologne that had haunted me through 1,000 sleepless nights. You don't get to do this, I whispered, but my voice had lost its conviction. You don't get to control every aspect of my existence. I have a right to a life. A life, his voice dropped to that lethal register that made crime lords reconsider their choices. You want a life, Clara. Your life is mine. Every minute you spend with another man is a minute stolen from me. Every smile you give someone else is a theft I feel in my bones. Every time you walk out of my office, I count the seconds until you return like a man waiting for his next breath. That's not, I started, but the words died when I saw his eyes. There was no calculation there, no careful control, just raw, undiluted hunger that looked like it might devour us both. I've tried, Barnaby continued, and for the first time since I'd known him, his voice held something that sounded almost like desperation. I've tried to maintain distance, to keep you at arm's length where you'd be safe from what I am, from what I do, from the darkness that follows me like a shadow. But watching you walk into that restaurant tonight, wearing a dress I'd never seen, smiling at a man who could never understand you the way I do. His hand moved to my face, fingers tracing my jawline with a gentleness that contradicted everything I knew about him. I am not a good man, Clara. I am not the man you should want. But I am the only man who sees you, all of you, the brilliance you hide behind efficiency reports, the steel beneath your perfect composure, the woman who can help me bury bodies and still wear sapphire silk like innocence. The rain continued its assault on the roof, percussion to this confession I'd spent 3 years both dreading and craving. You're terrifying, I breathed. Yes, his thumb brushed across my lower lip, and I felt the touch everywhere. But you've never been afraid of me, not once, not when you should have been. He was right, I should have been terrified. Should have run the first time I'd seen him break a man's will with nothing but words. Should have walked away when I'd realized the empire I was helping build was constructed on violence and manipulation, and the kind of power that corrupted everything it touched. But I'd stayed and pretended it was about the salary, about the prestige, about the challenge of managing chaos. I'd stayed because Barnaby Wycliffe was the most dangerous addiction I'd ever encountered, and I'd been dosing myself with him for 3 years while telling myself I could quit whenever I wanted. This can't happen, I said, but even I could hear how unconvincing it sounded. Barnaby's smile was slow, predatory, absolutely devastating. Clara, it's been happening since the moment you walked into my office and told me my previous assistant's filing system was an organizational catastrophe. You've been mine since that first day. We're just finally being honest about it. The confession hung between us like a live wire, sparking and dangerous. Barnaby's hand was still against my face, his body still cagging mine against the leather seat, and I could feel my carefully constructed world crumbling with each breath. There's something else, I heard myself say, and the words tasted like failure, like the admission that I wasn't the infallible assistant who solved every problem before it became his concern. Adrian wasn't just a date. Barnaby went absolutely still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. Explain, one word, flat, emotionless, the voice he used when ordering executions. I closed my eyes, unable to watch his face as I dismantled the illusion of my competence. My brother James, he got involved with some people 6 months ago. High-stakes poker games in Chinatown, underground gambling rings, the kind of operations that, I swallowed hard, the kind that intersect with your world but aren't part of your territory. Which faction? Barnaby's voice had dropped to that lethal whisper, but his hand remained gentle against my skin, a contrast that made my chest ache. The Kozlov operation, out of Brighton Beach. I opened my eyes, forced myself to meet his gaze. James owes them $300,000, money he doesn't have, money I don't have. They've given him until the end of the month and then they'll hurt him. Not a question. Barnaby understood the mathematics of debt and consequence better than anyone alive. Or worse, they'll hurt you to motivate him. Adrian's firm has Kozlov's legitimate businesses as clients. He's seen their internal communications, their organizational structure. I thought if I could get information about who actually controls the debt, maybe I could negotiate directly, or find leverage, or, my voice cracked, or something, anything that didn't involve bringing my personal disaster into your world. Barnaby's other hand found my chin, tilting my face up with inexorable pressure until I had no choice but to look at him. You thought you'd solve this alone. I didn't want to be a liability, I whispered. I didn't want you to look at me and see weakness, see a problem that needed fixing, see what, Clara, a woman with a family, with complications, with a life beyond these glass walls. His thumb traced my cheekbone with devastating gentleness. Did you think I'd fire you, cut you loose, decide you weren't worth the trouble? I thought you'd see me differently. The admission hurt more than I'd expected. I'm supposed to be the one who manages your chaos, not the one who creates it. Something that might have been dark amusement flickered across Barnaby's face. You manage my chaos by preventing anyone from knowing how much chaos exists. You create order from violence. You make me look civilized when we both know what I am. His hand moved to my throat, fingers resting against my pulse without pressure. But you're not my employee in this moment, Clara. You haven't been for a very long time. The limousine turned, and I felt us descend. The underground parking structure beneath Barnaby's building, probably. The private entrance he used when he didn't want witnesses. The Kozlov operation, Barnaby said. And his voice had transformed into something cold and mechanical. The voice of a man calculating vectors of destruction. Brighton Beach territory, primarily extortion and gambling, protected by 3 corrupt NYPD detectives and a state assemblyman they own outright. Run by Alexei Kozlov, mid-50s, former Spetsnaz, tends toward theatrical violence to maintain reputation. He was reciting facts like reading from a file, and I realized with a jolt that he probably had a file. Barnaby had files on every criminal operation within 500 miles of his empire. They put a price on your peace of mind, Barnaby continued, and now his voice held something sharp and hungry. Not anger at me, something far more dangerous. They threatened someone under my protection. They made you afraid. They made you desperate enough to seek help from Adrian fucking Merrick instead of coming to me. Barnaby's $300,000. He released me suddenly, sitting back against his seat, but his eyes never left mine. That's what they think your brother's suffering is worth, what they think your fear costs. They're going to learn they've severely miscalculated. The limousine stopped. Callum opened the door, rain streaming past him into our contained universe. Get out, Barnaby said, his voice soft and absolutely lethal. Go upstairs, change out of that dress. You're late for work and we have planning to do. Planning for what? Barnaby's smile was all edges and darkness. I'm going to explain to the Kozlov operation why putting you in a position where you felt you needed to have dinner with another man was the last mistake they'll ever make. He stepped out into the rain, and I watched him walk toward the private elevator with the controlled grace of a man who just decided someone's fate. Not my brother's, not mine. The Kozlovs. I'd spent 3 years watching Barnaby Wycliffe dismantle obstacles with surgical precision. I'd seen him destroy competitors, compromise law enforcement, and build an empire on the carefully orchestrated application of leverage and fear. But I'd never seen him do it for something personal. I'd never seen him do it for me. The rain continued falling as I followed him into the elevator, the sapphire dress clinging to my skin, 3 years of professional distance finally, irrevocably shattered. Whatever happened next, whatever line we'd just crossed, there was no going back to the careful dance we'd maintained. Barnaby had declared war on my behalf, and God help anyone who stood between him and what he'd decided was his. Barnaby's estate existed 40 minutes outside the city, hidden behind gates that cost more than most houses and security systems that could detect a sparrow's approach. I'd been here exactly twice before, once for a charity gala he'd hosted, once to retrieve documents he'd forgotten. Both times I'd maintained the careful professional distance that kept our relationship safely categorized as employer and employee. Tonight, that distance had burned to ash in the back of his limousine. He'd deposited me in the East Wing with instructions that sounded like suggestions but weren't. Change, eat something, stay. The last word delivered with an intensity that made it clear departure wasn't an option he'd permit. Then he disappeared into his study with Callum and 3 phones, the door closing with a finality that transformed the hallway into a boundary I knew better than to cross. I stood in the guest suite wearing one of Barnaby's dress shirts, black Egyptian cotton, still holding the faint scent of his cologne, and watched the rain assault the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city glittered in the distance, a constellation of lights that represented millions of people living normal lives, lives where their brothers didn't owe money to Russian gangsters, lives where their bosses didn't look at them like possession and salvation in equal measure. Lives I'd never have again. The house was silent except for the rain and the distant sound of doors opening and closing, vehicles arriving, men with purpose moving through the night. I recognized the rhythm of it, had seen it before when Barnaby was orchestrating something that required precision and absolute deniability. He was handling my problem the way he handled everything, with surgical efficiency and the kind of resources that came from building an empire on the backs of men who'd learned not to cross him. At 11:30 the activity stopped. The silence that followed felt different, final, like the exhale after a held breath. I curled into the leather chair by the window and waited, because leaving felt impossible and sleep felt laughable. At 1:17 in the morning, I heard his footsteps in the hallway. The door opened without preamble. Barnaby stood in the threshold, and something fundamental had shifted. His charcoal shirt was rumpled, the careful presentation he maintained stripped away to reveal something rawer underneath. Rain darkened his shoulders. His hair, usually perfectly styled, fell across his forehead in a way that made him look younger, more dangerous, like the version of himself he'd been before civilization taught him to hide his teeth. And underneath the rain and expensive fabric, I caught the faint metallic scent of gunpowder. "It's done," he said simply, as if he'd just completed a conference call rather than dismantling an entire criminal operation. I stood slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What's done?" Barnaby crossed the room with that predatory grace, stopping close enough that I could see the rain still clinging to his collar, could smell the smoke and cordite that clung to him like evidence of violence. "The debt is erased, the records destroyed. The men who threatened your brother have been given a comprehensive education in the consequences of touching what belongs to me." "Barnaby," my voice caught, "what did you do?" "I had a conversation with Alexei Kozlov." He reached up, loosening his collar with fingers that showed no sign of tremor, no evidence of whatever he'd done in the hours since leaving me here. "I explained that your brother had come under my protection retroactively, that the debt was now my concern, not his, that any further contact with James Whitlock would be interpreted as a direct challenge to my authority." And he agreed. I knew the answer before asking. Men like Kozlov didn't surrender territory without persuasion. Eventually, Barnaby's smile was cold and absolutely devastating. After I demonstrated the difference between his operations' resources and mine, after I showed him the dossier my people compiled on his organizational structure, every safe house, every corrupt official, every weakness in his supply chain. After I made it abundantly clear that the $300,000 he was owed represented a rounding error in my quarterly budget, but the principle of someone frightening you represented something I would burn his entire empire to address. He moved to the bar cart, poured 2 fingers of scotch with hands that remained perfectly steady despite whatever violence they'd orchestrated tonight. I also acquired his gambling operation, at a very reasonable price, considering the alternative was watching it dissolve around him. "You bought out the Kozlov operation." I said it like a statement because of course he had. Barnaby didn't just solve problems, he absorbed them, integrated them, turned obstacles into assets with the kind of efficiency that had built his empire. "The legitimate portions, yes. The rest I've distributed among associates who understand the cost of my generosity." He took a drink, his eyes never leaving mine. "Your brother's debt no longer exists, Clara. Neither do the men who were sent to collect it. The detectives who provided Kozlov's protection have received new priorities. The assemblyman has discovered a sudden enthusiasm for early retirement." He said it all with the same tone he used discussing quarterly earnings, as if systematically dismantling a criminal organization was simply another item to check off his list. But I could see the truth beneath the careful presentation, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he mentioned the men who'd been sent to collect. This hadn't been a business transaction. This had been personal. "You didn't have to do this," I whispered, even though we both knew that was a lie. He'd had to do this the moment I'd told him about the threat. Barnaby didn't know how to protect things halfway. "Yes," he agreed, setting down his glass and closing the distance between us with deliberate intent. "I did, because you're mine, Clara. You've been mine since the moment you told me my filing system was inadequate, and I protect what's mine with every resource I possess." His hand found my face, fingers sliding into my hair with a possessiveness that should have terrified me, but instead felt like coming home to something I'd been running from for 3 years. "I went to war for you tonight," Barnaby continued, his voice dropping to that lethal whisper. "I burned bridges and called in favors and demonstrated exactly why people are afraid to cross me. Not for business, not for territory, for you." The rain continued falling outside, washing the city clean, and I finally let myself admit the truth I'd been avoiding since the day I'd walked into his office and felt the ground shift beneath my feet. I was his. I'd always been his. And the man standing before me, dangerous and obsessed, and still carrying the scent of tonight's violence, was mine in return. I woke to grey morning light filtering through unfamiliar windows, and the weight of silence that felt too heavy to be empty. The guest suite, Barnaby's estate, the events of last night rushing back with the clarity of a photograph developing in chemicals. The folder was the first thing I saw, black leather, monogrammed with Barnaby's initials, resting on the bedside table like an offering. I reached for it with hands that weren't quite steady, knowing before I opened it what I'd find. Debt documentation, all of it. James's gambling markers, the collection notices, the threats that had been made, every piece of paper that proved my brother owed $300,000 to men who specialized in pain. Each page stamped in red ink with a single word, resolved. Beneath the documents, a handwritten note in Barnaby's precise script, "Your family is safe. They were always going to be safe. You should have trusted me with this." I wanted to. I looked up to find Barnaby standing in the doorway, and the sight of him stole whatever breath I'd managed to recover. He'd showered, changed into fresh clothes, charcoal slacks and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, but exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His hair was still damp, pushed back from his face in a way that revealed the sharp architecture of his features without the usual careful styling to soften them. He looked vulnerable, human, like a man who'd spent the night wagging war and returned to find the thing he'd fought for still uncertain. "You wanted to trust me," Barnaby repeated, crossing the room with that controlled grace that never quite disguised the predator underneath. "But you were afraid of what it would cost, of what it would mean." "I was afraid you'd see me as weak." The admission came easier in morning light, with the evidence of his protection still warm in my hands. "I see you as mine." He sat on the edge of the bed, close enough that I could see the faint scar along his jaw, the one I'd noticed 1,000 times but never dared ask about. "I've seen you as mine since the moment you walked into my office and reorganized my entire existence without asking permission. Every day since has been an exercise in restraint I'm no longer capable of maintaining." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Black, simple, the kind of box that held promises that couldn't be taken back. "I lit that cigarette in my office," Barnaby continued, his voice rough with something that sounded almost like confession, "because it was the only thing I could do that wasn't locking the door and keeping you there forever. Because the alternative to watching you walk away to meet another man was violence I couldn't guarantee I'd control." The box opened with a soft click. Inside, a ring, platinum band, single emerald-cut diamond, understated and absolutely devastating in its simplicity. The kind of ring that didn't apologize for what it represented. "I'm not offering you a bonus or a promotion," Barnaby said, his grey eyes holding mine with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "I'm offering you a choice. The normal world, safe, predictable, forever too small for someone like you, or my world where you'll never be a ghost again, where you'll stand beside me as an equal, not an employee, where every enemy I have becomes your enemy and every empire I build becomes ours." His hand found mine, fingers threading through with the kind of certainty that came from finally acknowledging what had always been inevitable. "Choose me, Clara, choose this, choose us." The rain had stopped. Morning light illuminated the room in shades of silver and promise, and I looked at the man who'd gone to war for me, who'd dismantled an empire to protect my family, who was offering me not safety but partnership in the beautiful, terrible world he'd built from violence and will. I took the ring from the box with steady hands. "I choose you," I whispered. "I've been choosing you for 3 years, I was just too afraid to admit it." Barnaby's smile transformed him, not into something softer but into something more honest, more real. "Then welcome home," he said, and slipped the ring onto my finger where it belonged. 6 months later, the rain returned to assault the floor-to-ceiling windows of Barnaby's penthouse office with the same percussion violence it always had. But everything else had fundamentally changed. I sat in the leather chair opposite his obsidian desk, not standing 3 feet away with a tablet pressed against my ribs, not waiting for permission to speak. The chair had been custom-ordered, positioned at an angle that communicated partnership rather than subordination. My nameplate sat beside his on the desk. Clara Pendleton, Chief Operating Officer, Pendleton International Holdings. The legitimate title for the woman who helped run an empire built on shadows. "The Singapore contract's cleared," I said, signing my name across the bottom of the document before sliding it across the desk to Barnaby. "The cryptocurrency transferred without flags. The Senators' Committee has been persuaded to table the investigation indefinitely." Barnaby added his signature below mine with the same platinum pen he'd used to sign our marriage license 3 months ago. A small ceremony. No guests beyond Callum and the judge who owed Barnaby enough favors to guarantee discretion. I'd worn champagne silk and emeralds that matched my engagement ring. Barnaby had looked at me like I was both his greatest victory and his most dangerous weakness. "The Rotterdam expansion?" he asked, his voice holding that familiar edge of precision that still affected my pulse in ways I'd stopped pretending to ignore. "Finalized, Volkov's people are in position. The warehouse security has been upgraded to our specifications." I pulled up the encrypted files on my tablet, our tablet now, synchronized to display the same information. 3 shipments per week, staggered timing, separate routes. Callum has assigned teams to each location. Barnaby leaned back in his chair, and I watched the movement with the appreciation of someone who no longer had to hide where her eyes wanted to rest. 6 months of partnership had stripped away the careful performance we'd maintained. What remained was rawer, more honest, a marriage built on mutual understanding of exactly what darkness we were capable of together. "The Kozlov properties are performing above projections," I continued, pulling up the quarterly reports. "The gambling operations have been restructured, the protection payments redirected through our channels. Alexei sends his regards and a reminder that he still owes you a favor." "He owes me considerably more than a favor." Barnaby's smile was all edges. "But he's learning his place in the new organizational structure." Thunder rolled across the city, and I felt the familiar charge in the air that preceded Barnaby reaching for his silver cigarette case. I'd learned to read the signs, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he was processing information that required the kind of focus only nicotine could sharpen. The case appeared in his hand with practiced ease. He extracted a single cigarette, and I watched him reach for the platinum lighter before I moved. My hand closed over his, stopping the motion. Barnaby's eyes lifted to mine, grey and dangerous, and holding a question he didn't voice. I took the lighter from his fingers, the metal still warm from his touch, and flicked it open. The flame erupted between us, casting shadows across both our faces. Barnaby leaned forward, touching the cigarette to the fire, his gaze never leaving mine. He inhaled, and I snapped the lighter closed with a finality that felt like a declaration. "We have the meeting with the defense contractor in 40 minutes, I said, setting the lighter back on his desk between our nameplates. "I've prepared the talking points. The senator will be punctual this time. I've ensured he understands the cost of making you wait." Barnaby exhaled smoke in a slow stream, and something that might have been satisfaction crossed his features. "What would I do without you?" "You'll never have to find out." I stood, smoothing my black Dior suit, the kind of armor that communicated power without apology. The emerald on my finger caught the light as I gathered the signed contracts. "We have an empire to run." The rain continued falling on the city below, on the kingdom we'd built from violence and will, and the kind of partnership that terrified everyone who witnessed it. We weren't just boss and assistant anymore. We were the king and queen of the city's shadows. And God help anyone who forgot it. If you loved Clara and Barnaby's dark romance, hit that like button and subscribe for more addictive stories of obsession, power, and dangerous love. Drop a comment telling me which moment made your heart race. I read every single one. Stay tuned because next time we're diving into a story where jealousy doesn't just simmer, it burns everything to the ground. You won't want to miss it.